I'm Aspen Baker. This is How to Exhale, our series on love and hate in America. And we are loving our new studio here. We're at the Civic Engagement Lab, otherwise known as Cell Space. We're right in the heart of downtown Oakland. And our special guest today is Dr. Ziska Ronquillo. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be talking about the emotional health and well-being of people who have abortions. So as many of you know, this is like the core mission of Exhale. And we want everyone to feel supported and respected and heard after an abortion. This is what drives us to listen to people on our talk line. And it also what drives us to confront the things that get in the way of well-being. Things like stigma and shame, things like sexism and racism, and even political or religious ideology. Some of you might know that this mission has been controversial at times. I was on Facebook last night and I was, scrolling through as we do, and an article popped up that said, anyone that says that there's a negative mental health outcome in relation to abortion is lying. It's not true. And I was like, oh. And then I realized, this is a pro-choice position. If I went elsewhere on the internet, I could find something that said the opposite, that abortion only has negative mental health outcomes. And I'm bringing this up because it's important for us to know that this is a part of sort of what's in the landscape of what we're talking about when we're talking about emotions and abortion and well-being. But our experience at Exhale over the last 15 years is that, it's all of this and so much more, and that it's just not so simple. What else was I gonna say? I got stuck at so simple. Our hope today is really to approach this from a different angle. And if we do that, we realize that we can have a very different kind of conversation. And Dr. Ronquillo is a clinical psychologist. She's staff at the Women's Community Clinic, and a big part of her job there is really to integrate their medical practice with their mental health services. And she's also a lead trainer at Exhale, which means that she trains our volunteers to become counselors on the talk line. And you have a very diverse and broad and deep, range of experience on lots of different things. And I know that one of the key things is really this integration of like body and mind. And so I think you're such a great guest to help us navigate this terrain today. So we're so happy that you're here with us.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here and talking about this. This is what I'm really passionate about.
All right. So why don't we get started and let's just kind of talk about that connection. Like, what is this connection between body and mind or emotions, and what do we need to know about that? Why is that important?
So I think most people experience their mind and body every day, all day long, and whether it's getting hungry, feeling tired, anything that kind of happens, it's a constant part of our experience. That's just kind of daily, everything's operating as you expect it. But then when things go wrong or you have something where you need a little more support, we tend to separate and think about emotional health and physical health, and you can go to the doctor and get physically well. But the reality, as where medicine is catching up with this idea of sort of, there's the medical model and then there's the sort of biopsychosocial and then the addition of cultural, spiritual, that really as humans, we have all these different parts and our bodies want to heal, but we have to think about how to integrate the healing on a mind-body connection. And that happens in a lot of different ways.
So you say hungry, you're like, I'm physically hungry, and then maybe I'm like kind of mad.
Right.
Because like I don't have
Angry.
food right in front of me. So then I have an emotion that's related to this.
And I think most people can relate to the idea of being hangry or knowing a very close loved one in their life that might get hangry. And how that's just the perfect example of a million things that happen all day long that are a mind-body connection. Things in every experience, you can have positive or negative, or with humans it's much more complicated. It's usually not black and white, even though we like to push it into those categories to make it easier to understand and manage. But the complexity of those feelings can be, hard to keep up with, and people kind of tend to just want to separate it out and make it easier.
So abortion is like a physical experience, but then we can have emotions around it, and they may be simple or complicated, or what makes it hard for us to talk about like emotions in general, or even women's emotions.
Yeah, so that's what really brought me to the work that I do both at the Women's Community Clinic and at Exhale, which is thinking about women as complex individuals who also face barriers because our society has a lot of inequities, and that's around gender. Really, women and any gender that gets targeted for being outside of the norm, and any other identity that intersects with that. So your racial identity, religious beliefs, anything that could be a compound inequality that prevents you from getting the help and support that you need. And we know that people are really impacted differently and have different resources, and that's interpersonally, but on a community kind of systemic level. So I'm really interested, the work I do at the clinic is about reducing barriers for low-income women to have access to an integrative holistic healthcare experience where they can get their primary care needs, their gynecology needs, and their mental health needs, as well as we have, acupuncture and other sort of more holistic care needs met in a place that's culturally inclusive and really promotes the idea of holistic wellness. So you can come in and all of your needs can be met because we're thinking and working together as a team, and reducing that barrier. And I think Exhale's work is similar because we're reducing barriers to emotional healing space, which isn't something our culture and society really values. Is just taking your time and sitting with the messy reality of our emotions, that one day you can feel good and the next day you can feel bad, and physically you may have healed, but there are spiritually you may not have, and maybe the things you used to do to take care of yourself, like going to church or being active with a friend group, is no longer an option because all of a sudden the thing you do to take care of yourself, there are beliefs that may not be in line with choices you've made, especially around abortion, but in a lot of different ways. So what do you need to do to adapt and think about coping skills that could support you and reconnect you to community? So that's a lot the work of Exhale, is reducing those
that
barriers.
sounds like a lot of our callers that
Exactly.
might have had some skills or support networks, and then there's the abortion, and it's like, can I use the same things that I've used before? Is this different? But I also wanted to ask you about maybe at the clinic, so you have all of these different practices. So does someone walk out the door at the clinic and now they're well? Or is this
that's a great question.
Are we done? Is there ever a time when we're
I think it's
done?
just like cultural inclusion, right? It's never done. Like it's a constant conversation of wellness and adapting and thinking about who we are and placing ourselves in the conversation and thinking about where we're at and what challenges we're facing. People go through their lives and have biological healthcare needs that come up that they can't control, pregnancies that are unplanned, all these things happen, and you kind of figure out how to cope and adjust. And a lot of times I think on the talk line it's creating that sort of sacred space for callers to think about what used to work and maybe go back to previous coping skills. And that's the beauty of the empowerment model, which I think is really a part of the work I do at the clinic and in Exhale, which is empowering women in a society that doesn't give us a lot of space and doesn't teach us that our voices matter, to be able to say whatever your voice is, however complicated, however human, however, a mix of beliefs that sometimes contradict each other, your voice matters, and we can create space for that. Yeah, you can be exactly as it is, and we need to support that and create safe, kind of trauma-informed, culturally inclusive spaces for people to really get to be with their messy, complicated emotions, regardless of their political beliefs, which are also important. In the personal is political, they come in constant contact, but how can we create that really just space that feels 100% healing?
Sometimes I think at Exhale we're kind of combating like multiple stigmas, like we're bringing these two things that people don't like to talk about, abortion and emotions, like together at the same time. And so sometimes, when people have a lot of questions or they're sort of not sure about what we do, it's hard for me to tell. Is it like, or they're not, they just sort of generally uncomfortable with counseling and emotions, or they generally uncomfortable with abortion. And so it gets very messy. And so, what's your take on that, like, messiness? And how are we gonna, move through that, culturally?
I think culturally, that's exactly right. We have to move through it culturally because it's so fused and embedded with so many, like, really deeply ingrained cultural practices and beliefs, as we all are as humans. So we have a lot of double standards in our society, and this idea that you should both be extremely strong and have it all together, and you can't need help, and you have to kind of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, and it's just the false reality that that's not actually the human way. The human way is through community and relationships, and people are impacted differently by that. So how can we heal in community and heal in those relationships and kind of move away from those double standards that are limiting? You know, it makes me think of the lady in the streets but a freak in the bed, like this idea that like women should be all the things, and men too. That apply, you know, patriarchy, everybody loses, racism, everybody loses. So it's like all the ways that we feel like we should be something but we can't live up to it, and what reality are we creating for ourselves to really nourish ourselves and have healthy, balanced emotional and physical wellness.
So I know that you're someone that cares a great deal about abortion being legal and accessible, and you're also a psychologist who talks about healing and coping and you know, creating space for emotions, and those two things don't always go together. That's not a super common. Back in the 90s, there was a clinical psychologist named Ave Toribueno who worked at Planned Parenthood, and she wrote this book called Peace After Abortion in 1997. She basically got like run out of her job and was discredited, you know, by her own peers for and so like, have times changed? Is it easier to talk about this now? Holding both of these things feels like a conflict, feels easy?
Not easy.
Not easy.
Not easy. I think that we have made progress. I think that in a lot of ways it's a movement. I personally believe that all access, when an individual isn't harming another individual and they need to access healthcare, that's their human right. And I work in a clinic where we provide abortion because I feel it's a human right. And there are all the other beliefs that go with it, and it's really complicated. And I work with to support callers and to support clients of the clinic whose political beliefs are different than mine, and I can understand the need to meet them exactly where they're at and not ignore my beliefs and who I am as a person, but allow that to come in and meet them where they're at and have that conversation that supports them. And then there's the whole other world around us, and I find that I work in a clinic that's nurse run and that is really empowering, and that it's a wonderful place to work as a mental health provider, because though the clinicians, the physical health clinicians that I work with have a completely different expertise, we respect each other's work and can integrate it into the clinic, and I think that is where we're at in medicine overall at this point. And then they bring in the whole kind of feminist movement, and how the history of the feminist movement is a time of constant gaining power and privilege and pushing other people out who were slowing down the effort towards equality. And that's the history of most movements. So the Lavender Menace and not wanting...
Tell me what that is.
So the idea, you know, in second wave feminism, so first wave, everybody voting rights, second wave in the late 60s and 70s, a lot of the feminist movements were led by heterosexual white women, and they pushed out women who identified as lesbian or not straight, and women of color, and that there were.
Is it the lesbian menace? Is that what you called it?
The Lavender Menace.
Lavender Menace.
It was. Okay. They were termed the Lavender Menace because they were like gonna bring down feminism.
Something that's complicating the
striving towards more power, and it comes down to power and privilege. And so anytime our message isn't clear, it gets pulled apart by the dominant structures in our society that we're working to change and to be more inclusive of the diversity of human experience. That creates this experience where people have to say, no, we're all okay. Everyone who's ever had an abortion is okay, because this is a valid thing for us to do. But, it's obviously much more complicated than that. It always is. And so I do think that I'm in a moment in medicine that's really integrating these ideas. And that was my access point to this work. So I think that because that's kind of coming in as an integrative health clinician, working at a clinic, I worked at the clinic before we provided abortion. I always wanted us to do that because it means more access for women. And the reality is that middle class and wealthy women always had access. It's the low income women and lower middle class women who didn't necessarily have access. So to me, it's about the kind of distribution of resources, and I think that we're ready for that conversation now. Even if
like
feminism is always going to get complicated, we're just trying to move forward.
Life is complicated.
We're
As
humans.
you said, we're
Exactly.
humans, and humans are complicated.
That's right.
So we have to wrap up, if you can believe it. It's gone by really quickly. Is there any final words you'd like to say to our audience about how they can take care of themselves around their abortion emotions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I always think about it as one day at a time, and thinking about it as an evolution, healing mind and body. So being able to look at every day of what do I need, what's one thing I can do to take care of myself today, whether it's getting good health care or calling the top line, getting needs taken care of.
That's generally across the board good advice, which I will take today for myself as well. So we're going to be back next week. Our special guest is going to be Joan Blades. Joan is the founder of Move On and Moms Rising, and her new project is called Living Room Conversations, and she's getting progressives and conservatives together in conversation in the living room. And we're going to learn a little bit more about how that's going, why we should do that, and what she hopes will come of it. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.